Story 1. Team Fortress Classic. I guess I prefer Half-Life, but I played about 10 minutes of that and jumped straight into Team Fortress Classic since I enjoy multiplayer more. Story 2. Wolfenstein, I suppose. I had a friend whose dad had a PC around 1993, so it was probably a 386. He had Wolfenstein 3D and a demo version of Microsoft Flight Simulator. I crashed the Learjet many times. I still believe that the destruction of Meigs Field is a crime against humanity, considering how many of us made our first virtual flights from there. Story 3. For me, it was Roblox in the early 2010s. My little brother was still using the arrow keys until around 2019 or 2020 when I finally got frustrated enough to actively tell him to use the W, S, and D keys on Roblox as well. Story 4. I didn't really play games on PC until high school. I feel like the first one had to be World of Warcraft. Maybe Counter-Strike. Source. Story 5. I learned it, but I hated it. I think it was World of Warcraft that solidified my need for it. Needing to move while casting spells required more keys closer to the movement keys. I used one of those boards until my cat chewed the wire. I didn't think to repair it at the time. Story 6. Great question. My initial thought was Descent, but I believe I was actually using the arrow keys for that. It was probably Tribes 2, which was the first time I got involved in a gaming community. Story 7. I believe it was either Medal of Honor, Allied Assault, or maybe Jedi Outcast. I definitely played Doom using the arrow keys, and the control button was for firing. Story 8. It must have been Star Wars Jedi Knight, Dark Forces 2. I remember using the arrow keys when I played Doom 1 and 2, or maybe Quake 1. Story 9. Roblox first-person shooter. I used the arrow keys for the longest time, but then one game required me to use the WASD keys, so I finally switched over. Story 10. I think it probably happened when the first truly three-dimensional first-person shooters started coming out. I played a lot of games like the original Doom and Rise of the Triad, but I am pretty sure I just used the keyboard for those. I believe it was Duke Nukem 3D or Quake where I learned how to use the mouse with my keyboard, which was also when I stopped using the arrow keys. Story 11. I think it was Unreal Tournament or Half-Life/Counter-Strike when I completely switched to using the WASD keys. However, I still play racing games with the arrow keys. Story 12. You mean Tab, Caps Lock, A, and S? I can only use my left thumb, so custom key mapping is essential. The first game I completed this way was Mirror's Edge. Story 13. I think it was the original Diablo. Many games from that time used the arrow keys, and I believe that may have been my first game that utilized the WASD key layout. However, I honestly cannot remember if it was WASD or not. Story 14. I never learned it. I was using the arrow keys before the WASD configuration became popular. I guess you can't teach an old dog new tricks. Story 15. In my mind, earlier games like Doom and Duke 3D used the arrow keys. I thought it could have potentially been either Delta Force or Delta Force 2, but they also used the arrow keys. I didn't really play Quake when it first came out, so I think it must have been Half-Life or perhaps the original Unreal Tournament. Story 16. World of Warcraft. Yes, I played a lot of first-person shooters, starting with the original Wolfenstein when it came out, but I always remapped the keys to ESDF. First, remapping them placed additional keys within easy reach, QAZ, for games where I needed more keys, such as Descent, which I loved. Second, if I had to lift my hand from the keyboard for any reason, like taking a drink or scratching my nose, I could position it back without looking because most keyboards have a small notch on the F as well as J for touch typists. Story 17. At 54 years old, I feel that I have been there since the beginning of video games, and I vastly prefer a controller. In fact, I can't play without one. Story 18. I used to play games on a personal computer with the arrow keys and switched to consoles around the Nintendo 64 era. I switched back when I got into Team Fortress 2 on the Xbox 360. When I realized it would not receive any updates, I got my own personal computer and adapted to it quickly. Story 19. In competitive shooters, I use a unique configuration. The right mouse button is set to walk, for example, and I've been mocked many times, so save yourself the trouble. In other games, I use the standard WASD setup because adjusting all the mappings to find one that works for me is a process. For games like Call of Duty, Fortnite, and Counter-Strike, I stick with my unique configuration. For everything else, it's WASD. It can be strange switching between games like Rust, WASD, and Call of Duty, my unique configuration, in the same night, but I can't play Counter-Strike, Fortnite, or Call of Duty without my specific setup. It's definitely unusual. Story 20. Descent 2, but the W and S keys were for up and down, not for moving forward and backward. I remember complaining about how strange that was. Once, my friend had a funky keyboard with 8 arrow keys, and I was really jealous. Story 21. I think it was Team Fortress 2 for me. I don't really remember, but I played Team Fortress 2 on an old laptop using the trackpad that came with it. I did that for a year before deciding to try out a mouse. I played as a sniper and was good at it despite using the trackpad. I even went on a 25 kill streak one time. It was a fun experience. Story 22. My dad had an emulator for many arcade cabinet games, and the WASD keys served as the player 1 joystick. Most of the other games I played as a kid allowed us to change the settings so the arrow keys functioned as the joystick. Story 23. I played Fortnite last year. However, I used to play Unreal Tournament 2004 and I used the arrow keys to move around. Don't ask me how, but I played that game like that for years. Story 24. I used to use the arrow keys to play. I played Guild Wars for a couple of years before switching to World of Warcraft. One day, my up arrow key broke, and I nearly quit playing. However, when I looked online for a fix, people suggested using the WASD keys, so I did. I got used to it and never looked back. Story 25. I learned well before the WASD layout. Does anyone care to guess the system? Although, to be fair, there weren't many first-person shooters back then. Story 26. Minecraft, but not until I was 40. I had been a console player my whole life, with the exception of playing games on my Commodore 64 I received when I was 6, and even those used a joystick. I had a difficult time learning the W, A, S, and D keys. My brain just could not coordinate the movements along with the mouse. Story 27. I think it was Quake. Other games before then had arrow keys, ESDF, or IJKL, but that was rare. From what I remember, some mech games used that key binding. At least I only played mech games that had that binding at the time. Quake really defaulted to WASD. I think Half-Life did as well, which was not long after Quake. So there was a shift around that time to WASD. Story 28. I was going to mention Doom or Marathon, it could also be Quake. For a while, the arrow keys were essential and mouse aiming was not. Story 29. You could have just as well asked who invented the wheel. You are asking something from the prehistoric era. Story 30. Minecraft. Before its release, I primarily played top-down strategy games from the 1990s, such as Maximum Action or Millennium 2.0. You might think I'm old, but I'm 19. Story 31. The earliest memory I recall is playing Jazz Jackrabbit 2 on one keyboard. One player used the WASD keys, and the other used the arrow keys. This was in 1998. Story 32. It took me a moment to understand what you were discussing. I have never played games on a personal computer, except for the time I tried it and quickly realized I did not enjoy it. Story 33. Doom in the Windows 98 era. Unless it was used in Tomb Raider, but I don't remember the controls for that. Story 34. I have been personal computer gaming since the 1980s and have never adopted the WASD control scheme. If a game does not allow me to customize the controls or does not support click-to-move, I do not play it. Story 35. Minecraft, but I primarily use a controller when possible. I dislike using the keyboard for most action games. Story 36. As with many others, I played the original Counter-Strike. It took me some time to adjust. I was initially resistant to the change. I used the arrow keys for a long time in that game. However, once I made the switch, I realized how much better it was. Story 37. Counter-Strike or Battlefield? I don't remember. I used to play both at a local LAN cafe and paintball store. Story 38. As an experienced gamer, I am not familiar with the term WASD. Does Nanny MUD count? I will open my diary from when I was in the Boer War. Story 39. It took me a long time to unlearn using the arrow keys. I grew up with the prepackaged games on Windows 95 which used arrow key controls, and then moved on to the original LEGO Star Wars which also used arrow keys and the numeric keypad if you were playing in two-player mode. I think it was eventually Minecraft resetting my control scheme that made me stop switching everything over to the arrow keys. Story 40. I don't know why, but I dislike using WASD and typically use ESDF instead. In some game I played years ago, probably Quake or a derivative, the action use was bound to R. I never got over that, so having it on my index finger next to forward is how I play. Story 41. Spore. I was 9 when it came out, and my only prior PC gaming experience was Flash games, thanks to Congregate and Y8, my favorites. Story 42. It was so long ago it could have been anything. Sonic on PC, Flash games on Newgrounds, couldn't tell you. Story 43. Gary's Mod. I played Murder Mystery with my cousin on his laptop. He taught me how to crouch jump, and I remember how uncomfortable it felt to reach for the left control, space, and W keys all at the same time. We took turns, with one of us using the keyboard while the other controlled the mouse. Fun memories. Story 44. I still remember insisting on playing with the arrow keys, but eventually I switched to the WASD keys because it allowed me to press the spacebar more easily. Story 45. I have to unmap it in every game I play. I despise the person who came up with it. I use ESDF. Why? Because when I started playing shooters, there was no microphone or voice communication. Interaction was text only, and if you weren't quick about it, you got headshot while standing still. My words per minute improved from about 20 in high school to about 90 my freshman year in college. Having to move my fingers to the home row to type a message and then back to the standard control layout to play is the most frustrating control mapping decision ever made in the gaming community. To this very day, I will judge you if you can't effectively communicate via text. You aren't skilled if you can't. Story 46. Wolfenstein 3D, the original, took a long time to download via bulletin board services. I can't recall how many packets needed to be downloaded over the modem to reconstruct the installation disk on your own PC, but it was a lengthy process. Story 47. Square Meal on Miniclip. My brother and I enjoyed playing multiplayer, but he didn't like using the WASD keys, so I adapted to it. Story 48. Half-Life 1 started with remapping to the arrow keys but gradually moved to proper WASD controls. Initially, I was mapping A and D to turn left and turn right instead of strafing. Story 49. It was either Quake or Duke Nukem. I remember having to use a console executable to make it work, but I can't recall the details now. Story 50. From a random Flash game of Captain Underpants, there were 2 characters. One was controlled using the arrow keys and the other with the WASD keys. My friend didn't like the WASD controls, so I used them instead. Story 51. Minecraft. I discovered a few months ago that my hand rested on those keys naturally, which is why it started to hurt when I was working. Story 52. Overwatch 1. Until then, I always relied on the arrow keys. I made the conscious decision to learn the standardized key bindings around the time Overwatch 1 was released. Prior to that, I used the arrow keys and the surrounding buttons since the days of Wolfenstein 3D. Story 53. Pokemon Green, emulated via No-Cache GB back in 1996 on my friend's 386 or 486 PC. I don't know if WSD was just the standard configuration or if my friend mapped it that way. Story 54. Duke Nukem 3D is such a great game. I played it when I was about 7 years old. I also enjoyed the freeware games on the Windows 95 disk like Velocity, which helped me along the way. There was a robot game from around 1995. It was my first official game called Cyclones. I wasn't very good at it, but it was a cool game. Story 55. Helldivers 2. Before that, I always used a controller. I think I will stick with it for the future. Story 56. A magazine article depicting the winning key bindings of a recent champion. At that time, my keyboard could not handle it. Pressing the W and A keys simultaneously would also press two other keys unintentionally. Story 57. I'm going to mention Doom. It started my love for first-person shooters. I didn't have a PC before Doom, and I don't recall another prominent shooter before that one that I wanted to play enough to learn the keyboard controls. It was worth it. Story 58. Asheron's Call for Me. Many people talk about Doom, Quake, and Unreal Tournament, but I am almost certain all those games use the arrow keys by default, and I never thought to keybind them to WASD myself. Story 59. Doom was the first game I played, but I didn't truly master it until I played Unreal Tournament. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.